So good morning, everybody. Thanks, Julia, for the introductions, and also thank you to the Oxford Farming Conference for the invitation to speak to you today. As Julia says, my name is Neil Heseltine, and I live and I farm in a village called Malham on the southern edge of the Yorkshire Dales National Park with my partner Lee, and we have a young daughter, Violet. It's very much an upland farm, and every derogatory designation that can be thrown at a piece of land applies to ours. There's about 80% of it above the moorland line. It's less favoured area. It's severely disadvantaged, so it's not regarded as being particularly good in agricultural terms. We would beg to differ on that, but it is also unique and brilliant for nature if it is allowed to express itself. But it looks very different to that this morning. It's covered in snow at the moment. But very much a livestock area, and consequently it's from a beef and a sheep perspective that I'm mainly going to speak to you today. But I think a lot of the principles cut across many of the sectors. But firstly, I'd just like to go back through a brief potted history of some of the policies within the beef and sheep sector that have been in place over the years during my farming life. And the earliest of those that I can remember, almost in a nostalgic kind of way, is when it was a real treat to go to Hellifield Auction Mart with my dad through the 1980s. Often it was because I was off school, not well enough to go to school, but definitely well enough to go to the auction with Dad. We would be there to sell a couple of store cattle or a few sheep, but my abiding memory was just being transfixed by the process, the hustle and bustle of the auction, sheep and cattle going in all directions, pen after pen of fat lambs going through the market, and watching the grader, who was assessing every lamb before they went through the ring to ensure that they were of sufficient quality to be sold through the fat market. And for each lamb that made the grade, the farmer would then receive a top-up payment from the government over and above what the buyer, usually an independent butcher in those days, had paid in the ring. And although I didn't realise it at the time, I was witnessing, and it was my first experience of government intervening in food pricing mechanisms, albeit in a fairly crude way, by ensuring that farmers received enough to encourage continued production, whilst at the same time placing the downward pressure on auction prices. Into the 90s, particularly the late 90s, we moved to a more formal and a slightly more professional version of policy with the advent and introductions of headage payments, which, as the name suggests, was about paying an amount to farmers for the number of animals they had on their farm, or more accurately, the number of female animals. And obviously, the more you had, the more subsidy each farm received. This incentive was more about increasing production, and it undoubtedly had its desired effect. Numbers of breeding animals soared, and there was a plentiful supply of beef and lamb coming onto the market. So government were happy. Supermarkets, who were the main buyers by this stage, were also happy. They could pick and choose where their meat came from and almost able to name their price. It was becoming evident that we were starting to lose control of the marketing of our products. Prices plummeted to their lowest levels, and both sectors were at their lowest ebb. The intended purpose had been achieved in terms of increasing production, but we learnt that if we all do the same thing at the same time, the economic consequences can be devastating. Even with the subsidy, we were working harder for less money. As we moved into the new millennium, government was starting to recognise some of these unintended consequences, some of which were environmental, with increased grazing pressure having an impact on nature, particularly in the uplands. And we moved into the single farm payment or basic payment scheme, where we receive a payment for each acre that we farm or manage. Relatively quite simple, easy to administer, and it seemed more passive in comparison to its predecessors, in that the outcomes and what it was aiming to deliver, either economically or environmentally, were less well defined. And it was almost that lack of clear direction in its ambition which ultimately led to its demise, as it became increasingly difficult to justify to taxpayers as we left Europe. But it undoubtedly kept farms in business, without the need and pressure to increase prices at the farm gate. So prices were compromised, albeit in a more nuanced and almost a subversive way. In essence, for as long as I can remember, there has been a policy in place which have all had their strengths and weaknesses, and they have all in some way provided opportunities. But in every case, they have also either intentionally or unintentionally resulted in a downward pressure on our food prices, and consequently has had an effect on our ability to control, manage and market our own produce. So what of the future? Well, we'll only fully understand the success or otherwise of the sustainable farming incentive in the fullness of time. And before I extol the virtues of SFI, I'm going to caveat my next few statements by saying that it should have been rolled out much more quickly. It should have been live and active some 18 months to 2 years ago. But that aside, what is being promised is that we potentially have a policy that is reflecting what is being asked of us by society, by enabling us to receive an income for providing healthy soil, clean water, clean air, reducing flooding, amongst many others. But we also have a policy that enables us to receive income for providing possibly the three most important things that global society needs at this moment in time. Namely, food, the mitigation of climate change, and nature's recovery. And as individual businesses and as an industry, we are unique in our ability to do all of that simultaneously. We've been asked to deliver what society most needs in the same way we were post-war, just with slightly different outcomes. And it would be folly for us to miss out on that opportunity. But what I find really interesting is that within that, SFI is offering us choice. We effectively have a spectrum laid out in front of us which goes from full-on food production at one end to full-on environmental good at the other. And we can choose, as individual farming businesses, whereabouts on that spectrum we would like to sit. We can be at one end, or we can be at the other, or we can be anywhere in between, all depending on our individual farm, our individual farming circumstances, what motivates us as people, and what we want from life. They will all determine where we would like to be on that spectrum. We don't have to have the binary argument, either amongst ourselves or with others, whether farming is about food production or it's about nature, because SFI offers us the opportunity to make that individual choice depending on the outcomes we each want for ourselves and our families. As we've learnt previously, if we all do the same thing at the same time, it doesn't always end well for farmers. But giving people that individual choice creates its own more natural balance between food production and the natural environment. In addition, we're also being offered the opportunity to take back some control of the food we produce. We potentially have a mechanism which doesn't attempt to manipulate either the levels of food we produce or the value of that food. It becomes more about the laws of supply and demand, and we can be the orchestrators of that. So for the first time in my farming life, going right back to the days at Hellifield Auction with my dad, we have a policy that is allowing us greater control. We can start to regain the initiative in the transaction between buyer and seller. And I think we're already starting to see an example of that pay out in the marketplace. As BPS slips away, the sheep market is starting to find its own feet, and consequently lamb prices have been consistently highest we've ever seen. For the first time in almost a generation, we have a policy that gives us choice and more control, and the opportunity to use, and that undoubtedly enables us the opportunity to take our own destiny in our own hands. So embracing and engaging with SFI means us facing change and facing up to change, but also finding opportunities. There's no doubt that we're being held to account in how we currently produce food, and it's only right that we're being asked those questions, because we need to be answerable in our impact on the environment. But SFI can enable us to use that scrutiny to the benefit of our businesses and respond in a positive way. We can answer those sceptics, who also happen to be our customers, our consumers, the people who buy our food on a daily basis and say, hand on heart, we've literally cleaned up our act. We've responded to what is being asked of us by producing food whilst fully respecting the natural environment. But we've also created dynamic, innovative businesses in the process. And whilst that brings an economic and an environmental benefit, most importantly, the biggest beneficiaries are us, the people within our own industry. We can create businesses where we look at our place within it, the number of hours that we work, the downtime we don't have, the number of accidents on farms, the mental health issues in our industry, all of which we need to address. I fully congratulate OFC on their conference title of Facing Change, Finding Opportunities, but I think we can be more proactive than that. Let's have the desire to seek change, to create our own opportunities for ourselves and our families. We can make it into an industry that is brilliant for nature, brilliant for food, but also brilliant for the people within it. SFI is a policy that could deliver all three simultaneously. It just needs to happen, and it needs to happen quickly. Thank you very much.